well as those maps around the continent, you can look at this map, and you'll see all the little red marks there are entirely non-existent islands that have appeared on the charts for years and years. By happy coincidence, there's 18 of each. Some are little spots, some are quite large. Now that isn't always the easiest slide to see, so I've done some improvement on it. I've put large red and green spots, as you can see, the ones that do not exist and those that exist. And the subject of this lecture, the non-existent islands. You will understand, ladies and gentlemen, it's taken me rather a lot of work to find pictures of the non-existent islands to show you the slides. There are various reasons for this, which you'll appreciate in the course of the lecture. Going back to the earliest ones, basically, it was with Francis Drake, Elizabeth Ideas coming around Cape Horn. And the most recent Soviet maps that improved was Trolls Klippen in 1929. More about that later. If you look at them all, here's the locations. We can look at them roughly in geographical order. South of Africa, volcanics. South of Africa, rocks. South of Australasia, some islands. South of the Pacific, quite a lot, quite a large area. South of South America, then some of the far south of the Atlantic Ocean, and some of these missing and odd rocks. How do they get on the charts? Well, ladies and gentlemen, these are my reasons. Sometimes it's a huge tabular iceberg that can be mistaken. If it's pack ice and it's rafting, that is, it might be a meter thick, two sections press up on each other, meter gets higher, can look a little more like an island. The endurance lecture, you'll remember how the pressure ice caused problems there. If you rock other moraine debris on it, it might look a little more like land. And remember, your concepts of distance, the whole perspective can vary in the Antarctic. Poor visibility, fog, what you may or may not see is one question. Poor navigation, I think that's an answer to quite a few of them. In fact, it means the captain didn't know where he was. Sometimes a bit of flotsam, exaggeration. There's a good one about this. When approaching the Ross Sea, Roald Amundsen, Lord Frown, saw what he thought was an amazing island in the distance. Changed course, went closer to it, saw there were birds around it. But he didn't have a concept of distance. He eventually came closer still. It got a name. Dead Whale Island. Volcanoes, doing their things. It's a little bit like Shiva in Hindu mythology, destroying and creating. Islands come and go on that basis. Sometimes it's a straightforward transcription error. A clerk copying latitudes, longitudes made a mistake. Some of these islands are ephemeral phenomena. Mirage, with the cold air and circumstances, can do it. A deceptive cloud. Perhaps lost ships. If a non-existent island has appeared on the chart, a captain or anyone else will have a degree of expectant attention. That can fool you. And sometimes, in many instances, err on the side of safety, the captain's caution. Best to have a non-existent island on a map if there's any doubt, in case there's a chance of running into it. This, however, can backfire. If you're a bit doubtful, put it there for safety. But if you put it there for safety and it doesn't exist, and someone's genuinely sinking and tries to go for it, you understand there's a backfire. If it's got birds and seals on it, that's substantial. Wildlife, well, they can settle on icebergs as well as land. You see, I put rum. Not everybody who reported these islands might have been sober. And there's a string of question marks at the end, because I don't think that's all the questions, although it is quite a lot of things as why you would have had various origins of non-existent islands. Now, the status of them. At least 50% have never existed. A small number have been found to exist, but they were in the wrong place in maps. So they did exist, but they didn't exist where they were thought to exist, if I make myself clear. And there's a couple of them that were ephemeral islands. Volcanoes did their things, as far as we can tell. So, the tests. Corroboration, reliability of observers. Some are more imaginative than others. More about that later. Bathymetry, Measure the depth. If you're in the vicinity and it's 4,000 meters deep, the chances of an island are fairly small. Sail round it, see it from all sides. That's a good test. If you can land on it, that'll work. All of these provide corroboration. Not all perfect, of course, but you can land on ice just as well as you can land on land. Some examples. Deception Island, 1967, first of several eruptions. There it is blasting forth. Montague Island, 2012, South Sandwich Islands, quite a major eruption. In some areas, for instance, the South Sandwich Islands, that's a chain of 11 volcanoes. If you look at the northern end, it's only 27 meters deep, Protector Shoal. The island you can see, Visokoi, is erupting fairly regularly. At the south of it, Visokoi Bank, Protector Shoal, I'm getting back to front line. Similar things, only 84 meters deep. And some swathes bathymetry, only a few years ago, in the vicinity of the South Sandwich, found that appearing unmapped in the seabed, and it's fairly obvious you've got an incipient volcano there, how shall I put it, ready to go. Many of these isolated islands, the peri-Antarctic islands, are in fact volcanoes. Here's a very good example of Heard Island. You can see it erupting fairly substantially in 2002. The bottom one shows vast amounts of lava steaming from the crater down some glaciers. It's not a good photograph because, of course, the lava is melting the glaciers and boiling them, so there's steam all over the place. You get an idea of lava going over the glacier. Near those is a small outcrop, the McDonald Islands. Here's a picture of those. And the first landing on those was in 27th of January 71, which, as you'll see, is about 6 months after the first landing on another place you could recognize. The first view of those islands, the McDonald's, was from HMS Challenger, and there's the sketch drawn in 1873. Now, with some recent eruptions, you can see the two maps below. Each one has in yellow the outline of the other one. 1980 it was quite small. 2003 it's more than doubled its size with an active volcano. So these things come and go. A good example here is if you look at Kerguelen, that's on the top, and bottom right is Heard Island. Look as you go over between them. It's only 92, 12, 190 meters deep. Something's coming up from over 1,000 meters in one zone, 200 or 300 in another. But there's places where there's shallows in a volcanic area. There's hot springs and steam vents on Kerguelen, and Heard Island, as you saw, is quite active. So that might have explained some of these things. Another story, you saw this map when I was talking about the unveiling of the Antarctic. Well, let's have a closer look at the bottom end of Africa. There's islands shown there twice. Denia and Marsabine, almost in the middle of the map, and you go a little bit to the left and you can see Prince Edward's. They're the same. Look at the other double-headed arrow, Gough Island and Diego Alvarez. They're the same. It's just the captain didn't know quite where he was, got him in the wrong position. So these have appeared on maps and people have continued to search for them until the accurate position was found. Ice. There's been times when vast amount of pack ice has gone well north. The 1850s were one, the 1890s an enormous amount. But here's an example. It's a ship, the George Thompson, approaching the Drake Passage in 1867. You can see that it looks as though rather a large amount of ice will soon be on her deck if you look up that way. With these things at times when vast amounts of ice broke out in the past, you all remember the news of A23A, in the present, that can happen from the great ice sheets at any time. Some of the larger icebergs, for instance, here's one in the Ross Sea. B-15 broke off and was marauding run. This one has knocked the end of the Rogalski ice tongue off, and you can get an idea of the size of it. As it's melting and fragmenting, especially if it has moraine on it, that can be a substantial phenomenon. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is a rock. Looks fairly reasonable, plenty of rock evident on it. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is an iceberg. It looks as though it's got even more rock on it than the rock had. The reason is it had been ploughing the bottom of the seabed. It had overturned, so it's an upturned iceberg with all the moraine, the dirty material from the seabed. So you might think that looks far more like an island than the rock I showed you earlier. Perspective, it's all over the place. Sometimes you can see cliffs like this, or edges or escarpments, till you get close where they're only that big, and you completely lost your sense of distance. There's something which might look like a rocky coast, but that's barely a metre above the water, as I can show you there. In many cases, with perspective entirely out of question, unless you can get several observations from different angles, who knows, and add fog to it to increase the degree of uncertainty. This is an illustration from Captain Cook. He said that resembled the Belle Isle. That was a large steamer, quite an old one, that was used as target practice. But his description there, I think, fits it fairly well. Edward Wilson, in fact, created that one. As with deserts, with rarefied air from the temperature, you get condensed air of greater density from the cold atmosphere in the Antarctic, particularly, for instance, katabatic winds coming down the hills. So you'll get these optical phenomena, the mirage, hot ones and cold ones. Those islands are just about on sea level, as you can see, the ones I took, photographed in McMurdo Sound. And here's Wilson drawing them. These low-lying things looming high. Look, particularly the photographs I have, those huge mountains in the background. They're just the ones you can see at sea level refracted up. So you can see considerable distances in the right circumstances. In that case, a very cold, clear atmosphere with hardly any wind. Cases like this. It's all icebergs, but one does be far more likely to convince you that perhaps it's an island. Also, straightforward lies, if you get the concept, ladies and gentlemen. I told you about the sealers, how they were exploring all around the Southern Ocean, looking for places with abundant seals. If they found some, they weren't going to let on. The captain kept that secret. He wanted to come back for subsequent years and didn't want the opposition taking his seals. So there's quite a few cases where deliberate falsifications have been given. In the case of Macquarie Island, there's a good pub yarn about bets being placed, not wanting to give the actual area. So to confirm a position, someone wrote it in chalk underneath a bar table, and the table was sold for a lot of money very quickly by the proprietor of the pub to another sealer. But the sealers are responsible for many discoveries and quite a few strange ones. Geographically, if we look south of South Africa, there's three, all quite close together. If we look at the maps, it's very convincing. 1826, Liverpool Island, Thompson Island, all of them there, and you can see nicely sketched, good maps and sketches of them. Other people, other maps have indicated islands in that position. Here we have 1880, part of the Admiralty chart, giving Thompson, Bouvet or Liverpool, Lindsay, and the Chimneys. Admittedly, it says the position of these islands is uncertain. It is not talking about the existence. These are volcanics, ladies and gentlemen. If an island has a name, the Chimneys, that's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? Here we have Valdivia's map. You can see the course of the ship, found Bouvet Island, and navigated carefully to avoid running into the other ones. 1898, all definitely on a map. Captain Scott's map, published with his final works, the mapping of the Antarctic, still has them there in 1921. The Admiralty issues regular notices to mariners, and after Norwegian and indeed Shackleton's last expedition searching for them, they couldn't find them. So in the case of Thompson Island, the Chimneys, it's considered the existence of these islands has been disproved. And rocks north of Bouvet Island, it's the same thing. And the final sentence, they are to be expunged from the charts. The sort of things that happened here, though, you have in green Bouvetoya as it is. And these two shallows near it, 98 and 69 meters deep, roughly in the position where some of these non-existents might have been. The balance of probabilities is round about 1894, a volcanic eruption. Bouvet still has fumaroles and fairly active. just blasted them out of existence. So those are some that might have existed. South of Africa, apart from these volcanics, there's two rocks, Pagoda, named after the ship, and Trollsklippen, the Norwegian for Trolls Island, or Trolls Rocks. You can see that the survey ship found the first, and a whaler found the second in 1929. If you look at the maps, there you have Pagoda Rock distinctly shown on the South Polar Chart of the Admiralty in 1912. The question about it existing, Pagoda reported it, and in 1980, in view of the possible further investigation, this reported rock is to be inserted on the charts. We've had one expunged, we've had another one come on. Subsequent searches, here we have Shackleton's Quest expedition after the death of Shackleton. They were looking for it, and in the position found it as 5,310 meters deep, so it can be with safety expunged from the chart. That was the end of that one. And Captain Hendrickson's Trolls Island, Trollsklippen. There it is, there's a sketch of it he made. There's two maps searching for Pagoda Rock and Trollsklippen. Ladies and gentlemen, if you look at that, you've seen enough icebergs to be suspicious of what that might be. In the case of Pagoda Rock, there was a manual on it. They saw rocks and things about it. A floating berg, suitable shape, with a bit of rock on it. Well, to make a long story short, fooled them. South of Australasia, Australia and New Zealand, there's a couple of them that lasted a long time on the maps. Royal Company Island and Emerald Island, let's get that right. If you look at the maps, there's Campbell and Auckland Islands of New Zealand and Macquarie Island of Australia exist. But here we have quite respectable maps with the Royal Company Island and Emerald Island. Indeed, in 1908, the New Zealand pilot published this book, the 8th edition, going around describing New Zealand itself and all the offshore islands. And in the inset, you can see the little inset at the bottom. I've put the red arrow. It shows Emerald Island shown on the charts, and there it is appearing on a quite respectable map. However, to give the New Zealand Admiralty much credit, it wasn't absolutely certain. The existence of this island is very doubtful, but it continued on charts for a long time. Emerald Island also could have been Macquarie Island. It's about the same latitude, so it might have been a sealing captain who didn't know where he was. And if you look at the colour of Macquarie Island, the tussock grass on it, you'll see why it could be called Emerald Island. So there's an hypothesis for that one. There we have Royal Company Island, indicated on the map there, and we have the existent ones, Auckland, Campbell and Macquarie. Again, a respectable map, that one's about 1880. The Pacific Ocean, ladies and gentlemen, a big ocean. Look, there's at least 4, there might be 5, whether Doherty's or Keats are the same one or a different one. They're not very different, all reported on maps. There in fact is only one, Peter I Island, found by Bellingshausen expedition in 1821. But let's look at them individually. You've seen Royal Company and Emerald, move round a bit. There's Nimrod Island or Nimrod Group and Doherty's Island, and more as you proceed towards South America and Drake Passage. Now, Doherty's Island, there was press about it. This is an extract from the Otago Daily Times, published in South Island of New Zealand. And William Stannard of the Mark Thurso is commenting, he's seen it, he's sure it's there, he says for all the tea in China. Nobody else has seen it. The chart, here it is. Captain Scott's one again. There's Doherty Island. Now, Nimrod, coming back from the Antarctic, left Sydney, heading round Cape Horn, doing surveys all the way, looking for Royal Company, Macquarie, Nimrod, Doherty, sailing close. John King Davis, the captain, was an efficient mariner. Okay, Macquarie's there, it was real. He searched the lot and found none. The Norwegians, wondering whether they might be sites for a whaling station. After all, these terrible British were charging them fees and taxes for using South George as the South Shetlands and the South Orkneys. So here we have searches made for them. by a Norwegian expedition out of Cape Town, almost all the way around to the New Zealand side and back, searching and found nothing. As a result, the Nimrod group and the others, and various searches by 1935, all reference to them is to be expunged. But, ladies and gentlemen, here's a little bit of weird and wonderful. Someone, actually in Spain, decided that there'd be some sort of federation of Doherty and Hesperides Islands. It was an entire construction. They published stamps, Cinderellas they're called, they're false stamps that some collectors rather like. You can see it has freedom of religion, there's the justice situation, there's going into space, there's a flag for the islands, and they even have the Tokyo Olympic Games. It's surprising what some people will do to sort of make a profit, but if they are really keen on philately, that's a set of some non-existent islands with stamps. You see, it's a bit easier to get photographs than many of you might have thought. However, there's Swain's Island. This actually appeared as an atlas, the Times World Atlas, an atlas of the Indian Ocean that went to the Antarctic, went to the other side, and this really wasn't part of it. It included it for completion. But look, not only do we have in the 1992 edition of Swain's Island, here I've blown it up, someone has lovingly drawn bathymetry lines around it. As I mentioned, erring on the side of safety. It's a lot easier to get these things onto maps than to get them off of them. Excuse me. It's not a suggestion I need alcohol, it's just this way. Peter I Island. That's the one cited by Bellingshausen. It does exist. It's now claimed as Norwegian territory, and that's a real one, as distinct from the other 4, or perhaps 5 I've shown you. South and South America. Well, at the beginning, Elizabeth Island is the first one to be found, but there's a couple of others there also, Birdwoods and Middle Island. That's the map that Francis Drake produced when he was going through Magellan Strait. Drake didn't go through Drake Passage, but at the far end of Magellan's. Let's turn it the other way up so it's easier to understand. You can see he has Elizabeth Island there. He drew a map of it. There's a lake and a river. There was even timber and things there. He stayed there for a while. He was a fairly good navigator. He had a very difficult job getting through the Magellan Strait, so that might have been something useful to find. There's nothing there these days, nothing known. But you look at the map, and in that vicinity, there's the Beagle Channel we came through, but you have Pactolus Bank, which is only 123 meters deep, and you have several shallows along here. And the area at the southern end of South America, and indeed to the South Shetland Islands, is volcanic. So it may have well been something that once existed. And the map of it you saw did indicate it could be something with a crater. The most southerly bit of land in this part of the world is Diego Ramirez and Chileno Islands with a lighthouse. There's Cape Horn, of course from there on, you know what's next, we've just left it. Birdwood Bank. If you look at the shallows, 44, 46, 53 meters, just south of the Falklands. That could, Birdwood Island's been reported on occasions, with shallows like that, a stranded iceberg with a bit of wren on could well explain that island. South Shetland Islands, Middle Island, here it is. George Powell, John Wright discovered it. There it is on the maps, looking extremely convincing. You can see Deception Island, which we saw. It appeared on subsequent maps, 1826 with sealers, and to Monteville in 1840. And by the time it reaches 1840, you see it has some contour lines. And Yelson, with his ship, Captain Larson of the ship Yelson, added it to the map. You can see at the bottom left here that he actually changed course to avoid hitting it. There it is. It was the Admiralty chart, after whaling had begun there and there were more investigations, entirely removed it from the chart. But several navigators, including some reliable ones, saw it. So let's look at it these days. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wave my arms because quite a lot of you can't see if we use the red dot. Deception Island we know. The Axe, the Three Sisters, in red, Orca, Bridgman Island, I can't reach that far up. They're all volcanic. Deception's erupted substantially. I showed you an earlier picture. Bridgman was erupting when James Weddell saw it in 1823. Orca, Three Sisters and the Axe, the book, are all underwater. But they're gyrants, submarine mountains, slowly rising. And I put Orca in red because that's producing quite a bit of sulfur dioxide. That seems to be tectonically rather active. So perhaps Middle Island was one of these volcanoes doing its thing. By the way, we don't only have non-existent islands appearing on maps. There's Bridgman Island, image on the top left. The green arrow shows where it is. And there's a fairly recent chart published where an existent island is non-existent. Someone didn't copy that one properly. You can see King George Island in the Elephant Island group, but not a Bridgman in sight, which is a little bit embarrassing. Now, south of the Atlantic, some more weird and wonderful. Isla Grande, Aurora Islands, and New South Greenland. Well, here we have the map you saw with the two islands off Africa, with Isla Grande there. I've also put an arrow for Drake's Elizabeth Islands. Nothing of that vicinity. But let's look at some of the books published at the time. The Nautical Magazine, January 1835, Isla Grande, South Atlantic Ocean. There's a letter from Captain Goes On, giving some time and detail about it. You see, the Nautical Magazine is quite a serious publication. But it's quite straightforward after describing it what it was. They have a picture on it made by a gentleman who was a passenger on the ship. And at the end of it he comments, it was nothing more than an ice island. It may assist others in forming their judgment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you've seen enough of them to, I think we might agree that that's a very likely theory, isn't it? Bear in mind that a lot of the people who are reporting these have never seen icebergs before. The Aurora Islands. Well, there are shag rocks, they really exist. Bottom right has them, all covered in, well, there's nesting grounds for blue-eyed shack, Phalacrocorax atroceps, and we know what birds are, that's why they appear to be white. And the other image on the left is an aerial view of them. The original view of those, description of them, by a Spanish frigate, a good navigator, described something much larger, but in roughly the same position. I don't think they've changed much. He might have been fooled by a large accumulation of pack ice around there with the rocks in the middle. So Aurora Islands rather than just shag rocks, that's possible. Here's a fellow who made 4 Antarctic voyages, Benjamin Morel. Here's his book. You see he's got his dividers south of the Tropic of Capricorn in the Antarctic. He had an interesting reputation. He was known as the greatest liar in the Pacific, which is a fairly large ocean. As well as his book, there were 2 other books, one by Jack Halliard, which is a sort of seaman's tales for children, more or less, and he didn't get on well with the captain. And the other book, on one of the voyages, is by his wife, Abby Jane Morel. And the attitude is somewhat different. It's a bit hard to think they were on the same ship. Morel did make a number of discoveries. One, New South Greenland, even occasionally called Morel Island. Here we have a map that William Bruce produced in 1911. And look at it. You have the Antarctic Peninsula. I've blown up that section here, and there's New South Greenland, this land reported by Morel. Morel is also a fellow who, looking for seals on South Georgia, reckoned he'd sailed around the entire island and examined every harbour and anchorage in 4 days. He's also a fellow who saw something that was flying around the South Sandwich Islands that looked a bit like the bird of paradise. Now, even assuming it was a squirrel that had been eating the inside of an elephant seal and got himself in a bit of a mess, that isn't easy to analyse. But there's New South Greenland on maps at various times. And it was interesting because when Faulkner, aboard his vessel, coming north after being caught in the ice, with Deutschland, then he made a survey from the ship going to the west to search for it and found nothing. And then, when Endurance, as we've just heard, was going a little further to the west of the island, Shackleton's expedition went further east to see if they could find any sign of it. The bottom map's rather good. You've got Filchner aboard Deutschland and Endurance with Shackleton aboard on the other side, the red one. So they both resolved and looked at the land, one examining resolved it into icebergs, and finally getting 3,500 meters deep. There was further evidence of the non-existent New South Greenland. The other ones. Remember I began with Charles Clippan? Well, these are all found by Norwegian whalers or vessels involved with the whaling industry. You can see them there, all quite close together, with Charles Clippan a little further round. I think they were all icebergs, basically. I rather suspect the captains of these small Norwegian vessels, erring on the side of cautions, were trying to get islands named after their ships. But the islands, let's put it this way, melted away. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've run round. I gave you a score. There's about 10 of them might be icebergs with moraine on them. Grounded icebergs, Birdwood, perhaps Middle. There's several of them where the captain really didn't know where he was. And volcanoes, well, we could have Middle Island in that too. And imaginative ambition. That was Captain Benjamin Morrell living up to his reputation. Now, just a couple of other things, ladies and gentlemen. You have now had non-existent islands. Look at these two publications. The Annals of Tourism Research, special issue, Antarctic Tourism. The World Bibliographical Series, volume 151, the Antarctic. Look, ladies and gentlemen, they're both missing an entire continent. So, on that basis, there is a question you might like to ask me, but I'll be in the seminar room. Thank you very much.